Well, hello Rainbow's Nursery, and time for another story from the Bible. But before we have that story, let's think for a moment or two about promises. A promise is when someone says to someone else that they will definitely do something. So, some of you might make promises to your mummies and daddies, or to the people who look after you. You might say something like, I promise that I will eat up all of my food. Or you might say, I promise that I'll come in from playing in the garden when you call me. Or you might say, I promise that I will be kind to my little brother or sister. And sometimes grown-ups make promises to us, don't they? So a mummy or a daddy or an older person might say to you, I promise that I'll take you swimming on Saturday. Or they might say, I promise that if you eat up all of your hot food, you can have ice cream afterwards. Yummy. We all like ice cream, don't we? And the thing about promises is that it's really important to keep them. When someone says, I promise that I will do something, it's really important that they do that and they keep their promise. And in the Bible, we see God making lots of promises. And it's all part of the way that God rescues the world. So a few weeks ago, we saw how God made a good world, didn't he? Full of lots of wonderful things. And he told human beings that they were to look after the world. But then, because those human beings disobeyed God, it all went wrong, didn't it? Do you remember we looked at the world and we said, oh no, it's all gone wrong. But the wonderful thing about God is that he didn't give up on the world once it went wrong. God was committed to putting it right. And part of the way that God does that is by making promises about the things that he will do. God's rescue of the world involved his promises. And we saw that in the story of Noah that we looked at last week, didn't we? God told Noah to build that boat, and that was the way that he rescued Noah and all of those animals. But do you remember the rainbow at the end of the story? The rainbow was a sign of God's promise. God promised Noah through the rainbow, and God promises us through that sign that he'll always be a rescuing God, that he will never flood the world again. Well, the story continues today with the story of Abraham. Abraham was married to someone called Sarah, and God said to Abraham and Sarah that they had to leave the place where they were living. And so that involved a great deal. They had to get everything that they owned together. They had to get all of their tents. They had to get all of their servants and all of their animals, and then travel, because God had told them to leave their home. But God didn't just tell them to leave. God gave Abraham 3 amazing promises. Promises that we're going to hear about now. Can you count to 3? I'm sure you can. 1, 2, 3. God didn't just make Abraham 1 promise. God didn't just make Abraham 2 promises. God made Abraham 3 important promises. I wonder what they were. Well, promise number 1 was this. God promised Abraham that he would give him a land, a special place to live. And that promise was important because when the world went wrong, Adam and Eve had to leave that special part of the world that God had made for them, didn't they? Do you remember that from that story? And so God promising Abraham a special place to live was a sign of God making the things that had gone wrong with the world right again. So that was promise number 1, a land or a special place to live. But what was promise 2? Promise number 2 was this. God promised to give Abraham and Sarah a family. But not just any family, God promised Abraham a huge family, a really big family with loads of boys and loads of girls. A family that will be bigger, God said, than all of the stars in the sky, and even bigger than all of the grains of sand at the seaside. And the reason why this promise was important was because these people, this family of Abraham, would all belong to God. When Adam and Eve disobeyed God, they had to go away from where God was, didn't they? And that made God sad. But now there was going to be a whole new family that would belong to God forever. So that was promise number 2. But there were 3 promises, weren't there? What was promise number 3? Well, promise number 3 was really the best promise of all that God made to Abraham. Because God said, through your family, through all these children that I'm going to give you, I'm going to put the world right and help all of its people. God was going to rescue the world, rather like he rescued Noah with the boat, and he was going to rescue that world through the family of Abraham. Wow! Weren't they amazing promises that God made to Abraham? And the Bible tells us that Abraham believed God's promises. He believed that God would do what he had said he would. Now that doesn't mean that Abraham got everything right. Far from it. Abraham got lots of things wrong. But Abraham did, through all the things that he did right and through the things that he did wrong as well, he kept waiting for God's promises. It's difficult to wait, isn't it? None of us really like waiting. We think, oh, when's it going to happen? And that was the same with Abraham. But for many, many years, Abraham and Sarah waited for God's promises. And one of the hardest things for them to wait for was that promise that God had made of a family. Because Abraham and Sarah were very old and they didn't have any children. And they waited and they waited. And they waited and they waited. But then, one day, something wonderful happened because Abraham and Sarah had a little baby boy and his name was Isaac. And that made them very happy, and it was a sign to them that God would keep those wonderful promises that he had made. And the thing about God is that God always keeps his promises. God promises us things, and God always keeps those promises. He kept those promises to Abraham of a special place, of a great family, and of rescuing the world through that family, in the end, by sending another little baby, a baby who was called Jesus. When it comes to Christmas time, we'll think more about the coming of Jesus, but Jesus is all about God keeping his promises, including those 3 promises that he made to Abraham. Well, I'm now going to say a prayer, and it's going to be a prayer that God would help us to trust in him, just like Abraham did. Let's put our hands together and maybe close our eyes and pray to God. Dear God, thank you that you love us. Thank you that you make us promises and that you always keep your promises. Help us to believe in you, and thank you for Abraham and for sending us Jesus. Amen. Well, that's our story for another week. I'll see you next week for another Bible story. See ya!